Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Sync meeting. This is a community meeting, and as such, it is being recorded. And please be mindful of code of conduct, which basically boils down to be nice to each other. Today is November 30, and my plan was to talk a little bit about the OBS proof of concept that we started a few weeks ago. And so far, as a quick recap, it went very well. We managed to do some nice things with it, and we managed to come up with something that is actually working, and that we were able to build packages. Those packages are installable, they're working as expected, and besides that, we also able to migrate clusters that were, for example, installed with all packages. This is something that I have been working on testing, and I think from that side, it went pretty well. The reason why I organized this meeting is that I would like to quickly go to that, to show what we did, to discuss is that good enough, and to eventually discuss some of the other concerns that we have about, especially about scalability, reliability, and eventually GPG keys. Okay, so I shared the agenda in the Zoom chat. Please take a look at it, and please leave you in the list of attendees. So I will get started with what we did so far. What we did is that we organized our OBS project that we got, which is ICV Kubernetes, in several sub-projects. So we first created a sub-project which is called Core, that is used for hosting the core packages of Kubernetes like KryTools, kubeadm, kubelet, and stuff like that. Under that project, we are planning to create a sub-project for 3 types of packages that we are going to publish. This is stable, which we have right now, but it is going to be pre-releases and eventually nightly for stuff that we push from Git commits. And in stable, what we have in stable is that we created another set of sub-projects, and this is for each minor release. The reason why we did that is basically because we want to have multiple releases in parallel. For example, we are triggering 124, 125, and then eventually 126 and 123. This is 4, maybe even 5 releases in parallel, depending on how many releases we support at a given time. And basically, what we found as an issue is that once you push, build starts automatically. And if you push again, you will cancel the previous build. So to actually support concurrent builds that we can do, for example, for different minor releases, the best way I found is using different sub-projects. I think that it makes sense. Maybe it is a bit more verbose, but I think this is the best we can accomplish what we want to do. And for example, when we go 124, this is our final destination for packages. We have 5 packages. This is KryTools, this is kubeadm, kubectl, kubelet, and kubernetes Sienna. Let's take kubectl, for example, because it is as simple as possible. Okay, this we can block it. Never mind. So what do we have there? For each package, we have a DSC for Debian packages, and we have spec packages for RPM. We have Debian tarball with Debian specification files, and we have Oric tarball with like binaries themselves and eventually other required files. So the issue that we had here is about multi-arg builds, and how we can accomplish, for example, that since we have those, we use binaries, we don't build anything in OBS, how we can actually accomplish that we can support, for example, CentOS, all those binaries here, same for Debian, same for Ubuntu. And the way I did it is that, for example, in Debian and in this, just a moment, I can't click on it. For example, I provide one tarball that has everything. And there, based on architecture, I chose the correct directory, take the binary from there. Similar goes here. It is just that I put for here for architecture any. Technically, this is not any, and I'm not sure if this is the best way to do it. But this is the way I went for it, because it turns out that depending on what build environment you use, this is what is actually going to be architecture here. So architecture of the package. So this is the way I did. And basically, when you take those two turbos, Debian 1 basically has only Debian directory with stuff that we have here. And it works in the same way. For example, if we work open rules, let me see if I can zoom this out, probably not. I have like check the arc, and based on that arc, I take the binary, and that's basically how we got the multi-arc builds working. And yeah, just as a quick note, this is how the binary looks like. Yeah, so basically for every architecture subdirectory with the binary. The question that I would ask here is, what do you think about these folks? Like, is this over-engineered? Have you missed something important? Is this something that you think that might work? Because I believe you probably have much more experience with this than us.
So it's okay for me to say something at this point. I think you've largely done it pretty okay. Given how simple the packaging is, I don't know why we don't just consolidate this with just the spec file to build for both Debian and RPM targets, because like it's less stuff, it's one set of operations to maintain. And it also fixes the issue that you have down there about the revisions, the revisioning behavior not matching between the two platforms. Like just looking at your DSC and your spec, like it's 2 extra lines to the spec file to make it fully Debianized as well. Like you just need the packager flag to map to the maintainer because it's a mandatory field in Debian. And we need the that cube arch variable so that it consistently reports the architecture back to install the correct binary into the file list. Like the rest of it otherwise is like bone stock the same. And I think it would tremendously simplify the workflow here and give us a lot of, and really make this a lot easier for not just consumers, but also like the Kubernetes people upstream and whatever, because it's just less work.
One comment about change revision number sync. You want to have OBS to bump the revision number, and there's a flag that you can set in the DSC file that it will also do that for Debian packages. So you can get consistent behavior between both. I actually fixed that this year.
Okay,
yeah,
I see it.
I didn't realize that had been fixed because it was broken for many years.
OBS is not doing it by default because it's a Debian behavior, and you need to enable it via the flag that it should update it.
Also, on the flip side, you can turn off the revision,
I pasted
the auto revision.
I pasted the flag here. Darik's implemented in the chat.
On the flip side, you can also disable the auto revision behavior for spec files by overriding the value that OBS uses for the release field.
Yeah,
I strongly do not recommend you do that because bad things will happen to people. But in this case, where you're only repacking binaries, the risk is a lot lower. If you are building from source code, that changes this whole thing quite a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, if you use own DSC files or if you use the helper, and at the end of the day, it's a matter of taste. So whatever works for you. So if that works for you, fine. If you want to consolidate it via the helper and build Debian based on spec files, also fine. So I don't think it's a major thing. You could adapt this also later.
Okay.
And regarding the project structure, it's one way to do it, and they're absolute fine. And I mean, this leads to the situation that you have always an own repository for each version. Maybe this is what you want, but there would be also a way that you have one repository with all versions, but that might be then not be handy for your users to pick a version. So, but both is possible. You now picked the version where you always need to switch a repository to switch the version. If this is what you wanted, then everything is fine, I think.
Another option would be aggregating into ISV Kubernetes stable, and you aggregate all packages in there with an aggregate file, and then the user only uses that repository, and you can change which is loaded into this stable repository.
Yeah, or yeah, that would be one redirection more. You have one project and you have a suffix on each package container name, so that you have a kubecontrol.v 1.6 or so, and then you can also have multiple in parallel. But yeah, but as said before, it's absolutely fine if you want to have separate repositories and that's easy for your users, then everything is fine, I think.
So that
Yeah.
aggregate repository sounds good for maintaining backwards compatibility for the folks that are using the repositories as is today. And then we can give them the option to choose the per version repositories for more stability on their end if they so choose.
Okay, so yeah, this is something that I will take a look into and how it works. So basically, the one thing that we discussed internally at SIG release is that we definitely want to have it like per package, like each package dedicated here on OBS. This is what we know, and that is going to make it easier for user. Regarding repo and how exactly we are going to take in OBS is something that we can still change and that we are evaluating. We will see about those things that you mentioned, and then I can take a look into it. I assume, do you have some docs on that on the OBS handbook?
Also, I noticed that in the 125 and the 125 repo that you created a changes file and you have a changelog section with populated changelog entries in the spec file.
Yeah, that's correct, and I will probably drop that change of file. I think this was only from early. This was only from early stages of experimenting with OBS.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, pick one way. Don't do both because it's confusing. I personally don't like the changes file, so I usually don't use it. But that's because I'm a fan of the whole idea of all of the stuff related to the spec file. The packaging should be in one file. But if you want to go another way, feel free. It's just my recommendation would be pick one way exclusively and don't mix, because it gets very confusing to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Just as background, the changelog of the spec file always gets imported on the user installation. So we don't want to grow that the RPM database is growing too much, and therefore we strip the changes entries at certain point in the spec file, but we want to maintain the full history, and therefore we have a changes file next to it. But yeah, it's completely optional. And as Neil said, one way is enough.
There's two more things to pay attention here. First, the RPM spec file is you can only have a date, not a timestamp. So it can't differentiate between if you did something on, like, multiple people did something on the same day nicely, and also you have to take care about yourself for quoting macros and stuff. And yeah, that's the two things. Timestamps are not there, and macros you need to quote yourself if you want to mention them in the changelog and spec file.
Okay, that's good to know. I think generally our packages are very rarely changed. I mean, they're basically just taking the binary and that's it. Looking from our Git history, yeah, that's actually, in the most of cases, we change our tooling that generates the spec file, but not the spec file itself. So it's not going to be a problem.
The third option is to just not have a changelog. You could also do that too.
Well, I think it's nice to have a change log, and I think having the separate changes file makes it easier for us to manage the spec file as we currently do, because we generally use the same spec file for multiple visions. So separating that out will make it easier for management on our end.
No, that's totally fair. Just pick one way and make sure that that's written up so that it doesn't get mixed up in the future. Note that if you use a changes file, in order for it to work, the changelog section has to exist in the spec file. It just has to be empty.
Okay. Okay. Sounds
So
good.
if we can move beyond the changes discussion, one issue that I see with this layout is that you are not able to preserve published binaries of previous patch level releases, right? So in the 1.24, if I understand it correctly, when there's a 1.24.1 or .2 and so on coming out, you will lose the published binaries of the previous dot releases, so the patch level releases. Is that a problem that you are willing to accept,
So,
or is that something you want to keep?
Yeah, I think this is acceptable. My understanding was that, for example, you were able to go to revisions and, I don't know, browse source for this one and maybe
Yes.
pick it up. I don't know, do you like preserve those files? But I think
Yes,
this
that is preserved, but
So-
the published binaries will not be preserved. So the published repositories that you're building here, they will only contain the newest version of the binary.
So that would break existing users the way that we're doing things today. And my understanding is that there was a way on the OBS side in the back end that behavior could be changed.
Correct.
But just
So-
for the stable releases, we wouldn't necessarily want to do that for the nightly releases.
Correct. So you can release the binaries into a separate project that you just use for publishing, and then it would be preserved. So just the setup needs to be slightly extended.
Okay.
Okay, is this something that you need to do for us, or
No, you can
something
do it
that-
completely on your own.
Okay, then I can eventually ping you later so that we
Of course.
see
Yep.
about this. Okay. One more question now that we have leads here from SIG release as well. Something that I think, just a moment, let me see, so that I don't make a mistake. Yeah, now mention it at the beginning, is that we might eventually, if I got it correctly, consider only having one spec file, for example, for RPM, and then generate based on that. I think this was discussed on Slack as well, right? Am I correct? He's now still here. He's muted, looks like.
I'm sorry, were you asking me?
I'm confused. What was the question?
Yeah. So you mentioned something at the beginning as the first point about that difference between Debian and RPM packages. And as far as I understand, this is something we discussed on Slack channel. Did you mean about just having a RPM spec and that's all, like generate all packages based on it?
Yep.
Okay, now that we have SIG release leads on call, is this something that we want to do? Like from our user perspective, is that a nice thing to do? Or like we want to make sure, so one thing that worried about this is that users, for example, who are building Debian packages manually might not have experience with RPMs and how they work and macros and stuff like that. Like, do we want to go that route, or because of some user behavior, do we want to, split them? So, what's your opinion on this? Like, do you have any opinion, or is this something that you would like to discuss offline later?
For what it's worth, I just quickly made an example of what this would look like in a brand package that I threw into the Zoom chat. I'll also drop a link into the Cube Slack as well, just so you can see what it is.
Yeah. So basically, how it would look like is that we don't have DSC any longer. I don't know, can I open it side by side? But just a moment, yeah. We will not have this DSC, we will not have this Debian. We wouldn't have Debian files at all. Only thing that we will have is RPM spec, and it will be used to generate both CentOS packages and Ubuntu packages. So is this something that we should consider, or do we want not to break eventual users who might build themselves packages themselves.
So another thing to keep in mind is that these packages aren't building anything.
Sorry?
These packages don't build anything. They don't compile any code. They're taking a binary and then dropping them into a directory. Like, you're already violating most of the preconcepts of what people expect from normal packaging stuff. So like from a reuse and rebuild and whatever, like it's trivially, they're basically trivial packages from that perspective, because all the real build logic is happening way outside of this system. I think there would be a stronger argument to maybe consider having both if we wanted to build from source from everything inside of OBS. I would still probably make a case for unifying, but I think there'd be a stronger leg to stand on if it was going to be a more complicated package, and it's not going to be. So like, this just makes it less work. And the few constructs from RPM that are actually being used in this spec file are pretty simple for anyone to look up and pick up on.
So the question that I have is, if somebody today is using the source Debian package that we have to build their own Debian packages, how difficult would it be for them to actually do the same thing that we'd be doing in OBS of building the Debian from the RPM?
If you're talking about building from, so to be clear, Jason, I actually don't know whether how the packages work currently, if they're built from source or if they just take the binary as an input and then just drop them into the directory like this proposal does.
Yeah, that's basically what they're doing.
Oh, well then, yes, it's not hard for them to be able to do this. Like, you just install the deb build tool, run deb build BA, and you get the same output that OBS itself produces. Like,
okay.
The tooling is publicly available. I'm the upstream developer of it. The repos are published on the OpenSUSE build service for all the different Debian and Ubuntu distributions, including the ones that you guys are not supporting right now. And it's pretty easy for me to add new distributions to the support matrix, add more macros, do whatever. Like, my main goal around the tool is to make it easy to follow Fedora style packaging on a Debian system and be able to like simplify maintenance across the two platform types.
Okay, I will add this as an action item so that we don't lose too much time, and I will bring it offline with folks who are involved with our original packages and with SIG release leads, so that we can discuss and decide on what do we want to do. Let me just write it down. And I will share you up here. Thanks so much for sharing it, by the way.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
It looks like some files are actually missing from your source bundle, which is kind of confusing, but that's separate from the actual problem.
Yeah. Okay. I guess it wouldn't be too hard to debug it. Okay. Do we have anything else regarding this, or should we? Okay, actually, let's go to the next topic, and then we can eventually close this one. For what operating system should we consider publishing packages? Like, what I was thinking about is to make it easier for us, that we only publish, like, for CentOS 7, eventually for, I don't know, CentOS 8 is now end of life, probably doesn't make sense, but for CentOS 7, Ubuntu, and eventually for OpenSUSE for ARCs that are not available for CentOS, like RV7 and S390X. Should we, like, is it possible, for example, that if you take this repository for 2204 and then use for 2004, 1804, and other supported releases, or do you maybe anticipate some problems with that?
So
I mean,
theoretically, this should be fine. What you're proposing to do would be fine. You build on, because you're not compiling anything. You're just making package containers that ship and install on things. Your only real constraint at this point is whether the deb or RPM artifact is actually compatible with the installer on the distro side. So, like, if you choose that you're not going to support CentOS 7 anymore for Kubernetes deployments upstream, for example, and you want to go and say, we want to support CentOS 8 or newer, or whatever, RHEL 8 or newer, then you can just turn on a rel 8 or CentOS 8 target and just ship that and then create symlinks for all the other distro targets and have people just install with that. Same goes for Debian ones, because the binaries were not compiled distro specific. They were compiled outside, theoretically, in a broadly compatible fashion. So your only real constraint is whether the RPM or deb can be read by the host system. From that perspective, my suggestion is that you would go with CentOS 8, CentOS Stream 8 and Ubuntu 20.04 as your baselines, because that's broadly artifact compatible with what people should be using for this stuff. But again, up to you.
Okay, I will leave this out as a recommendation. I probably agree with that. I mean, Ubuntu 20.04 is probably the most used right now, so maybe it would make sure that we have compatibility with it. And yeah, another problem that when we consider, for example,
okay, just one remark. I mean, you can build against Ubuntu 20.04, but you could, I mean, the name of your repository is basically free text, so you could just name it Ubuntu, so your users would not be confused, and it might work on all versions. If it works, it of course depends on the binaries.
Yeah, you can name the repository target whatever you want. So, like, for example, I have a project that actually, even though it builds against CentOS Stream 8, I call it Enterprise Linux 8 because it targets all EL8 platforms. And I have an Ubuntu one that's like deb type, and it builds against like Ubuntu 16.04, but it works on basically everything. So you can do that kind of thing to make it easier for people.
The other thing I would argue as far as architectures, we probably wouldn't want to ship any more architectures than we're currently doing today. I don't know exactly what architectures we're building the RPMs and debs for today, but I wouldn't add any additional support for the initial effort. And then if we want to, we can start enabling additional architectures, and if there are any issues related to that, we wouldn't have to deal with those at the same time as the initial transition of where the repositories are located and hosted.
Okay, yeah, I definitely agree with that. What you see here is for what 5 architectures we support right now. It is important to know that maybe, and this is what I'm also going to bring up, we discussed it with Siglids, is if we want to consider dropping some of those, maybe we can use this as an opportunity. For example, there are some words out there and some feedback we received from a Minikube maintainer that this ARM for 32 bits doesn't work at all. Like, so this is a lot of stuff that we need to check it to see, for example, is it really worth to actually go ahead and compile and publish packages? But this is something that I'm going to follow up offline, and then we will decide on exact set of architectures that we are going to use. Okay, and I don't know if you have any other questions, but I wouldn't hold too much of this topic. We have 30 minutes left, and I would like to discuss some other issues that we have. Okay, I will take that as okay. Yeah, so one question, and I hope it is going to be a quick one. Something that I observed is that sometimes we end up in a situation with building packages. Just a moment, check something. Okay, yeah. I wanted to make sure my headphones will not go out of battery, but okay. For example, we end up in a state that buildings succeed, for example, like this, and it gets checked, like there's a check mark, but then it gets stuck on, for example, waiting for repository to get created. And that can last for maybe even several hours. Before the repository gets created, and there's like green chunk. Do you maybe have an idea of why is this happening and how to debug that?
Yeah, well, there are 2 reasons why it happened. For one, all packages need to be finished building in the repository. And then the other thing, I mean, the build service is doing it as batch jobs. So if there are many jobs also for other projects, then it might take a longer time. We could, in theoretically, if this is a showstopper thing, we could put your project on an own backend so other projects couldn't interfere with it. Yeah, depends a bit if this is really important enough that we do that. But in general, that's how build service works. So you can put so much load on it, it needs some time to process it. So there are no guaranteed answer times.
I think the key part is that all the architectures in one repository, like in the screen share here, for example, it's waiting for an ARMv7 worker, which we have very few of. So only by the time all of them have built, it starts to publish. Right. So you can accelerate it by like removing architectures or moving architectures that are slow by nature into a separate repository. Right?
Yeah,
so you could say.
Well, but the publishing happens per architecture. So just because you wait for ARMv7, you should still get a publish of the other architectures. Just the ARMv7 then is late.
So let's hope I recapped it correctly. But so publishing happens per architecture, it waits for all packages to be done, and then it gets published, right?
All architectures all packages
in an
for this architecture in that repository need to be finished, and then the scheduler would schedule it for publishing, and then the publisher needs to have a slot to process it. And yes, you are currently on the generic other backend, so any other Devil or most of the other Devil projects are building there as well. So if there's a huge load at that point of time, it can take time.
Okay, yeah, understood. I mean, it was not really frequent, so I wouldn't consider it a big problem, but we can eventually discuss it if we end up in a situation that this makes some more issues. I just wanted to know why it is happening rather than that we actually have to fix anything right now. Okay, I will document that later. Okay, and now we have, this was the actual topic, so just now to go to a little bit harder topics. And this is about scalability concerns and infrastructure requirements. Our understanding is that we can host the Debian packages that we generate on OBS platform itself on the your build service that you provide for us. But we are a little bit worried that it's going to be a huge load, because if you, for example, follow what was happening with container images, you will see that load can get insane, and that it's a little bit something that we have to be prepared for and to optimize for. And therefore, we have been thinking if it is possible. So the first option that we considered is if it is possible to have some CDN, but that turns out to be a little bit expensive because various solutions are more expensive, and it might be a cheaper, for example, if that's possible, to take some instance like Connect Metal or some provider that is sponsoring the Kubernetes project and store the artifacts there, and then eventually find a way, for example, users that are close to that region, data center, whatsoever it takes, for example, for that machine instead of reaching to OBS. There is. Yeah, as Jeremy said in chat, maybe Deb RPM costs are even more than it is for containers. So that for Google is going out in millions probably. So quite a bad thing. So what do we wanted to discuss is what are our options regarding that? Is it possible that we generate those packages on OBS and that we eventually host it, but that we eventually mirror them to some other host and host it from them too?
So I'm a bit unsure about the size. So you speak about container, OCI containers in future also, or
No, I'm just
what happens?
yeah, I'm just speaking of comparison between what is happening on Google side with containers. We are not going to move containers to OBS. We are going just to get the packages, Debian and RPMs.
Okay.
But we have a problem, for example, that container images are seeing a huge load that's causing a very high costs. And we are worried that same will happen to packages as well.
I see that currently you use 10 gigabytes for one of the releases. That's with set repos and architectures you have enabled at the moment.
Okay.
The question, so 10 gigabytes is not too much at the moment. The question is how many additional versions will you put there?
Okay, I think from storage side, yeah, this is maybe something that we can also discuss, but what is worried me mostly for now is bandwidth. So not the what we use of storage on OBS side, but how many traffic are users that are using those packages are generating. For example, I see a question in chat that how many requests per second.
So Marco, let me try to answer your question. So the published repositories are currently put on download OpenSUSE.org, which is actually a distributed mirroring system. So there are various sites on the planet that are mirroring some parts of that space. Some of them, a few of them, or everything. So in a way, it's already distributed across a couple of sites, and it shouldn't be too hard to add an additional publish location that you control and that you own that provides the bandwidth relief. Right. So if that becomes a problem.
Okay, if that's an option, I would like to know a little bit more about it. What does it take to add additional publish location? Do we eventually end up in a problem with GPG keys that we had before, or that is still solved, or is there some problems that we might encounter with that?
No, so the part that is published is already signed. So the GPG keys are owned by the build service as before, and it's just about where the signed finished artifacts are being published. So that's independent of that.
Yeah, and in general, we can actively push on publishing, or you can pull via rsync. That, yeah, depends.
I linked the general documentation for becoming a mirror.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. And what's also important, so it works when you use the download OpenSUSE.org URL, but if you have a mirror and you want to point your users directly to your mirror, then it's also working, of course.
Okay, yeah, I think this might solve the issue that, for example, I guess we could create some instance, let's say on Equinix Metal, and then we can set up a mirror there, and then in fact eventually mirrors our packages. Is it only going to mirror our packages? Is that configurable, or eventually some other?
Only yours.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, there are the same modules for all of the home projects, all the different projects, so you can just mirror your own. I do this for mirroring ISV data inside of my workplace data because things.
One question would still be interesting. How many requests per second are you generating? So we can make sure that mirrors, so mirror cache is a current solution that is running on download OpenSUSE.org that we can handle the load on the database side and the web app stuff.
This is a little bit hard to answer. Like the infra that is currently hosting packages is owned by Google. And it's a little bit like a black hole for us. We don't have any idea about it. We just know that packages are there, but we don't really have any insights, any metrics, any sort of like consumption information. It is like we try to get that, but we didn't really have luck with that.
So I would say being optimistic and risking it for now is an approach that we can take, I think.
Yeah, maybe for example, if that would be useful in any way, is that we try to get the number of how's the traffic going for container images. That's a little bit different, that container images are totally different working, but might be one metric that we can try to estimate on how many users do we have.
I mean, these are clients in a way, right? So it's not like container image. So yeah, I don't think it helps us significantly.
I mean, you can just try. The worst thing what will happen is that it's not fast enough, and then we need to learn that we need some more mirror somewhere, and someone need to sponsor it. But it's
And we need to do work on mirror cache to handle the load.
yeah, but I doubt that the mirror cache will break down due to the load. That's I would be
Oh,
surprised.
we broke mirror brain. The previous solution we broke with load already.
Yes, but not just because of. Yeah, well, we will see.
I mean, anyway, I mean, the suggestion in the chat makes sense, right? So for this specific use case, we can publish also to like an whatever the Google term of an S3 bucket is. I don't know exactly that. And
GCS, Google Cloud
GCS.
Storage.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And use that as a hosting platform.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to recap that. Yeah, go ahead, please.
We can even make it that it's not even published to download OpenSUSE.org, but only to the mirror server that you want. And then users will only see it via your mirror and not via ours.
Well, I think from an ideal perspective, we would rather not. You know, one of the ideal solutions is that, you know, we basically offload the hosting and distribution of these packages. Obviously, if it's too much for, you know, the service, then we can, you know, we're happy to shed some of that and everything. But from a project perspective, we would like, you know, like every open source project, we would like to avoid additional costs for distribution as much as we can, if that makes sense.
I mean, there's a difference between you and an average open source project.
Well, yes, absolutely. You know, and how we can enable that, you know, I think there's some flexibility there on how we could potentially handle that. Is there potentially some type of agreement we can come to as far as potential avenues for helping fund the open build service through the Kubernetes project? Or, you know, does it make sense for us to, you know, have a mirror and solely publish things from our mirror? You know, I think, you know, what are the options there, and what is the best compromise that we can come up with there? I think there's some flexibility there on how we can potentially handle that.
Yeah, I think we are certainly able to take contributions for the OpenSUSE project. I think I would need to check how it's working these days. And yes, if at any point, if you have a mirror there, you want to be filled from us, just tell us and we can handle it.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so I also had some questions about GPG keys. So one thing that I noticed when, for example, take a look at the project, I think it is when you go, yeah. For example, the key expires like in 2 years from now. I think that we have discussed this before, but you have an option to regenerate the keys so that users don't have to change it, right?
Yeah, usually it happens automatically when it's publishing and it sees that the key is will expire. But yes, you can also extend manually call OSC sign key -- extend for your project.
Okay. Yeah.
There is one important bit. you need to force publish all the Debian repositories so it sees the updated key file before it expires. Otherwise, you run into pain. So if you extend your key, make sure that all Debian-based repositories are republished.
When you say republish, what do you exactly mean? Do you like just
Trigger one
republish the same
packet.
packages again?
You
No,
trigger one.
there's a call you can make from the OSC command line that will, or API that will let you force it to like rerun the publishing tasks for everything.
It's rebuild
Okay.
the repository as well. You need to trigger one package, which is the lightest package that you have. Otherwise, yeah, it's
Because Debian only signs the repo and not the packages. So that doesn't get picked up unless a package changes or you tell it to republish everything.
Okay. Okay, then that's okay. I will keep this in mind, and I guess when the time comes, you can eventually help us with that, and we will figure it out. It's just important that we avoid that users have to do anything on their side, if that's possible, so that we like reduce the amount of rating changes and stuff like that in the future. Okay. And one more question that I have, and then I will leave it time for other folks as well, is about integrating with OBS and something that I have been looking at. As far as I understand, the only way to publish the packages is like with OSC, and you have to create a user account for your on OBS and for your project, and then use it. Like you don't provide any API key mechanism that can be used for that, like to publish those files and specs and everything that we need. Or I have missed something.
with publishing, you're talking about uploading files to the OBS, and
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, you need
I
to
think
create a service account.
terminology is a little bit confusing in this regard.
You need to create a service account user to do this. And you'll probably want to just lock down who has access to those credentials.
Yes
Okay.
and no. You can use a service file that downloads the files from even from a Git repository. The OBS itself is published maintained in the OBS like this, and then you just need a token and the command that is OSC service run remote and the token in the command line.
That won't work for this case because they are, one, not building from source code, and two, they're creating a constructed binary, a tarball of binaries that they're uploading.
Yeah,
So
but
it needs
we
to
have
be
a download
personal.
service. There's a download file service.
Yeah,
but
that
source
tarball
service has
can
to be
actually
updated.
sit, that tarball can be generated and available publicly already.
Sure, but the download file service that downloads needs to know what the URL is, and that'll have to change, which means you're uploading a file anyway.
It has to be a set URL. It can't just be something that is related to the API request.
Yeah, but
Not
Like, can you
really, no.
provide
Something-
variables
some-
to it somehow?
something. Yeah, well, usually via the version, but you would need then to increase the version, so it's not so. I mean, what you could do, of course, is have a fixed.
This is why I wrote OBS
There-
tutorials, because this is very complicated to do.
Yeah, so there are ways one could write a service and it could construct the URL based on the package and project name so that you could grab out the version from there. But I doubt a bit that it's worth the hassle.
Yeah,
So
I definitely think it might be easier just to create an account and use it. But
Yeah, my recommendation is create a service account and just make sure that those credentials are kept safe. I mean, this is what the Zipper team does. This is what Datto does for stuff. This is what a lot of people do this because OBS doesn't have a concept of service service tokens associated to a user account. So
okay.
it's not a thing. Sorry.
That was what I thought from the docs as well, but I wanted to check that I didn't miss anything important.
Nope, it's good to check.
Okay, and I think that would be basically it from my side. So for other folks, we will work on proposal. and this is something that I will take on in upcoming days. And I will probably let you all know when it is ready so that you can take a look at it and that you can leave comments. From other folks, do you have any questions or anything that you would like to ask?
Not a question, but thank you very much, Marco, for all the work that you put into this.
Yeah, this was solid.
No problem, and thank you. I would be really happy to see this working. So let's hope that we can make it work. Okay. And in that case, since we don't have any other questions, I would like to thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. And this was really helpful. And yeah, we will keep a cycle Slack. I will let you know if we end up needing another meeting or something like that. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.